what we've really got now is this escalating blame game, don't we, between the Health Secretary and the unions. Who do you think's responsible?
Well, you know, it's very easy to blame the government, but I hold the government utterly squarely responsible for this issue, particularly for the nurses. You know, this was flagged back in summer. We all knew the Royal College of Nurses was considering strike action when it comes to the autumn. They were given the heads up. They didn't engage. They hid repeatedly behind the independent pay review body, claiming that they couldn't intercede in due process. But here you have, actually, what the government shut the country down 2 years ago to achieve, which is the lack of functioning of the NHS. Remember, we were told, for fear of the NHS not being able to cope, we should all be locked up at home. And here you have the NHS not coping. And it's a completely homemade problem. And again, you've got people at home being untreated. So I think what we've got, very sadly, is a spiral downwards, with the NHS having had 4 million people on waiting lists before the pandemic. Now that's up to 7.5 million people. You've got strike action. That's going to exacerbate the problem. And so if and when they get down to serious negotiations, and if and when this will settle, and no doubt it will settle eventually, you're going to have an even bigger backlog, an even longer waiting list for the NHS. It's a very difficult spiral out of which the government now has to get that public service.
Would you pay them 19.5% more?
No, but I would. No, I probably wouldn't.
Really? Probably. I mean, 20. That's a 20% rise. That's a huge increase.
Yeah. Okay.
For the taxpayer, 10, 11 billion pounds benefit.
But let's just understand this first of all. Over the period of time that the Conservatives have been in office, before the current spike in inflation, we had 25% aggregate inflation and wage growth in the public sector of around 5%. We had net real-term reduction of 20% even before the current spike. So they are legitimate. You know, these strikes are legitimate. They have a legitimate gripe, and the 19.5% claim is not unreasonable. Having said all of that, granted, public finances are under pressure. But, and here's the big but, the public sector wage bill is about $230 billion a year. They've already factored in about a 3% wage rise on that. So we're talking, I'm sure the nurses would settle for something around 10%. That's roughly where I think most of these disputes could be settled, including with rail and other services.
Just talking about those other disputes, do you think when it comes to strikes affecting the NHS, the government will treat those differently to, let's say, ones affecting the rails?
They should. Rail workers are on average paid much more than nurses are. And if you look, I haven't finished on my public sector total pay, but, you know, if you look at nurse wages in this country on average versus the US, Canada, Australia, you know, other OECD countries of which we're part, they're roughly half of what they are in those other countries. It's shocking. And that has to be put right. I remember when we were all encouraged to come onto our doorsteps and clap. You know, I looked at wages then and thought, I'm sure these people would prefer proper wages rather than being, you know, clapped in this kind of, sort of vacuous virtue signalling appreciation that we're all encouraged to indulge in. So, no, I've got great sympathy with the nurses, and I was just going to say that actually a 10% pay rise across the public sector is affordable.
Well, let's ask you about the ambulance workers, because the Institute for Fiscal Studies, no less, say their pay has not fallen back with inflation. In fact, they've done OK in the last 10 years, for some reason. Their own union bosses are the ones who've put their staff on picket lines. They know that could lead to debts. That will be the responsibility, surely, of the trade unions rather than the government.
Well, it's an incredibly emotive accusation, isn't it, Andrew? And it is an accusation that Steve Barclay and others are using, that you are going to be responsible for death. But in making that accusation, what I think the government is seeking to do, and I think, you know, in a sense you've just done, is to rob them of the right for legitimate protest.
Well,
how else?
There is talk that there will be a new law next year banning strikes in the 9/9 emergency services. Would you support that? Police can't go on strike. The army can't go on strike.
Yeah, and perhaps there's an argument for that. You know, I would need to look at what the law says and how it's enacted and so on before, you know, making comment. But the fact is they have a right to strike at the moment. That strike has been called legitimately. There has been public sector wage constraint for the last 12 years. And there is a social injustice here too. You know, with ultra-low interest rates and QE and all the rest of it, the rich have done really well over the last 12 years, and it's the working and middle classes that have suffered. So there is that imbalance, inherent social imbalance, that needs to be put right. You're going to start thinking, I'm sort of from the left wing. I'm not. I'm from a libertarian, deregulated, low-tax, sort of right-of-centre viewpoint. But as far as the public sector services are concerned, they have been underpaid for a long time. And the only way to really get people on their front foot working for you, whether you're in the private sector or public sector, is to pay them properly.
Who holds the strongest hand right now?
The nurses do. I think the public sympathy is with the nurses. And that may not be the case with the rail services at the moment, but certainly as far as the NHS is concerned, they still have the public sympathy.
And the question is, when will there be some resolution to all of this?